Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you with us today. We're thrilled to be able to bring this event to you with Ken Stern as our featured speaker. My name is Doug Dixon. I'm co-founder and secretary of the Encore Network, and I'd like to formally welcome all of you to our event today. While we're waiting for others to join us, please go to the chat and let us know your location. If you'd like to be in touch with other people who are present today, include your email address and maybe your LinkedIn profile, however you'd like to be connected. Lots of times people do like to be in touch with others who are present. We are recording today's event, and we'll be sharing that recording with everyone who registered for the meeting today in a follow-up email, probably on Friday. And that will include lots of resources and other things that you'll hear about during the discussion today. We ask that you remain muted during the meeting to eliminate background noise and distractions. We encourage you to ask questions or make comments in the chat during the discussion, and we'll get to those questions either as we go or in a 10-minute session at the end of the conversation today. And please, when you're putting a question in the chat, either put a Q in the front of it or a question. That helps us pick out the questions from other information in the chat. I am happy to introduce our interviewer today, who will then introduce Ken Stern. Lem Lloyd is a member of the board of directors of the Encore Network. He is a veteran of Silicon Valley. He has worked for firms and run operations and sales for Yahoo, Angie's List, Hot Jobs, CareerBuilders.com, and other Silicon Valley firms. His new venture is Longevity Workers, a career site focused on older workers. Longevity Workers is also the sponsor for today's event. We appreciate that. And because of that sponsorship, we have been able to purchase copies of Ken Stern's new book, Healthy to 100, which you'll hear more about shortly, and which he has taken the time to sign. So we have a stack of signed copies of Ken's book that we'll be giving free to all new Encore Pro and Encore Enterprise members, as long as that supply lasts. So make note of that. You'll hear some of the details toward the end of our event today. But we're thankful to both Ken and Lem for making that possible. So now, let's begin the good stuff today. Over to you, Lem.
Well, thanks, Doug. Thanks so much, everyone. It's exciting to have you with us, and I'm really excited today. I'm so pleased to welcome and introduce Ken Stern, who's joining us from Washington, D.C., the Power Seat. Ken is quite simply one of the leading voices around longevity today. He is the founder and chair of the Longevity Project, which fosters public conversation and research on the impact of longer lives on society. As part of this, and I'm going to give a little plug here because I really love these things that Ken does, he publishes several wonderful weekly newsletters that I highly recommend you subscribe to. We will include the links of these, hopefully in the chat. He is also the host of the award-winning podcast Century Lives from the Stanford Center on Longevity. And I believe, Ken, are you up to season 9, is it?
We're in the middle of season 9.
Wow.
10. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, those are also wonderful. He hosts several conferences each year, and I'm going to call out one because it's upcoming. It's called Healthy Aging, Aging with Purpose and Power and Play, and it's taking place on May 4th, so just about 6 weeks away on the Stanford University campus, but also virtually, so you can participate online. And I think it's a one-day event, and it's another great roster of folks. And last but not least, the reason why we're here. Ken is the author of several best-selling books, and it is his most recent work, Healthy to 100, How Strong Social Ties Lead to Long Lives, that he will be speaking to us about today. And as Doug said, I have my copy here that I have marked up religiously throughout the whole book, which I tend to do when I really like books. But Ken has signed them, so they're author signed. So if you do want to become a member of Encore, you get a really kind of a special book. So Ken, thanks so much again for joining us today. I know there's so much to talk.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about. Let me start with this. One of the central themes, the major themes of this book, your book, is around the power of social connections. And I was hoping you could maybe share a little bit more about this and why it's in your travels around the world and seeing all these different great examples, why it's become such a key factor for aging well.
So I think we have to start with the notion of why loneliness is actually a risk. Let's start with the converse. And I think as background, I would say, as Americans, we are used to the notion of associating longevity and health with things like exercise, nutrition, healthcare, even genetics. All those things matter, but we are not used to understanding that social, as a nation of 350 million people, not used to understanding that social connection and purpose is really important to healthy aging, and loneliness is a risk. And there are actually, important biological. One of the things that's actually hard, one reason for that, it's actually hard to understand the relationship. It's easy to understand the relationship between nutrition or exercise. We all instinctively understand the health connections there. The health connections around loneliness or social connections less clear, but there are important biological links. So, and I would start with the notion that we as humans have always, for ever since our existence, have known that being in a group is a point of safety, and being cut out from the group, being lonely, puts you at risk for all of human existence. And our biology has actually evolved over millions of years to the notion that
just ask people to mute if you can, unless you're talking. So thanks. Go ahead, Ken. Sorry.
Yeah. So our biology has evolved over millions of years, so that being lonely means our body responds to sort of chronic loneliness with chronic stress. And chronic stress, in turns, rise of cortisol levels, is directly related to inflammation, is directly related to heart disease, cancer, cognitive decline. And that's why loneliness is a huge risk to us as humans. Maybe we will evolve away from that over time in another million years. But right now, loneliness is a physical risk to us. And social connection, on the other hand, is a source of comfort, stress reduction, and health.
Yeah, no, I think it was just, it was so interesting to read. You really traveled. How many months were you gone? Because you must have been gone at months at a time, traveling around the world, the globe.
Yeah. So the framing of the book, Lem, is that we've seen the rises of loneliness here largely for the last 50 years, largely driven by the adoption of personal technologies, first televisions, now phones. And that has actually driven what I can call the American life expectancy disparity. We do so poorly compared to the rest of the world, to the rest of advanced economic countries. And it wasn't really all in that way. It's really in the wake of the loneliness crisis in the US that a large gulf as life expectancy and healthy life expectancy has emerged. I wanted to find out why other healthy aging countries are actually doing better than us. They have the same pressures. It's not like phones are not known in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Spain, Italy, where I went to. I mean, you get on the subway in Seoul or in Singapore, people are heads down on their phones just as they are here. But somehow they've adapted to that changing dynamics in terms of social connection better than we have. I wanted to find that story. So I spent about 4 months on the road, in crisscrossing Asia and Europe, trying to understand the different approaches to what I call social health.
Yeah. And I know one of the things that, as part of social connections, is what you found, and maybe you can talk about. I was fascinated in your trips to Japan and seeing how, with the older population in Japan, that I don't know, it's maybe half of everybody 65 is still working, and their attitudes on working, and that's how they have better social connections, I guess.
Yeah, so I would say one common thing about all the 5 countries I visited to and other countries that I've explored and researched is they all consider social, especially in the second half of life, social health as being part of public health. But they tend to address social health in different ways. That they're individual, each country has a different approach, some commonality, some differences. In Japan, the recipe around social health in the second half of life is a cultural norm that has developed really just over the last 25 years, that work past 65 is good for you. It is good for you in terms of having reason to get up in the morning, in terms of purpose, in terms of contribution to society, in terms of social connection. So roughly, so Japan, in addition to being the longest lived country in the world, is the country in the world where a higher percentage of older people work than anywhere else. And it's about 50, it's a little over 50% for people in the 65 to 69 cohort. It's still about a third as you get up to 75. And that's entirely different than it was 25 years ago. And one of the things that's changed is that the Japanese work culture has evolved in ways that is not here, has evolved to try to accommodate older workers. They've created essentially a second work economy that is built around part-time work, job sharing, assistive technology, lots of things that make it easier and more attractive for older workers to continue to work. And one place I visited was something called the Silver Genzai Human Resources Organization. Only time I've ever been to a human resources organization. They represent about 1 million older workers aged 65 to 106. And the only thing they do, they work with companies across the country and only in part-time work. So they've created this entire economy, 1 million part-time jobs they've helped create in partnership with companies and government organizations, all to ensure that older workers, if they want to, it's still only half, have that opportunity to get part-time work to keep them active and engaged as they age. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I think I had shared with you, I lived in Japan after college, so 40 years ago. And at that time, it was pretty much as it is here today. You leave a company and that's it when you retire. So it's amazing to see, really in a short amount of time, as you say, they have totally changed that whole mechanism that you can continue to work even at your company that you're retiring from.
Yeah. So it's actually kind of amazing. Because in many ways, Japan should have been the last country to create this, right? A notoriously competitive work environment and a very strict, you hit an age, you're out. I mean, that was like the rule. So you would think they're the last country to adopt to it. But what had happened, I think, which has not happened here yet, is Japan got a lot older very quickly, and its birth rate dropped so that the availability of workers in the traditional labor force age of 18 to 64 started to decline. And all of a sudden, companies, who were very much sort of up or out, began to realize that they needed older workers more than the older workers needed them. And that changed. That was sort of the government intervened and created all sorts of incentive programs. But it really began with that sort of aha moment for companies. I visited in a city called Toyama. I visited a machine tools company, and it was a family company, had about 200 workers. And the CEO is the daughter of the founders. Was everyone there was over 65. There were people in job shares. The people in job shares show up at 10, they leave at 4. There are all sorts of accommodations. She told me, like, her father would never have recognized the place because that was just not the culture. But the culture changed because of economic necessity on one side, and because the cultural norms changed with it. One of the things Silver Genzi does is they poll their million plus members, and 80% of these older workers report that they work primarily, perhaps not exclusively, but primarily because of the social connection, for the purpose, the meaning, the social connection, because they believe they can continue to give back in the second half of life, and that's the way.
Yeah, and I love you asked them when do you plan to retire or not to stop working, and what did they tell you?
So this was a common question, like, how many questions? I spoke probably 100 older workers in a course of 3 weeks, and you run out of questions. But one question I always was like ask them at the end is like, how long will you continue to work? And the answer invariably was until I can't. It was almost like an anthem that came back. And it stuck with me every time, because that's what everyone says, until I can't, because they associated with, so many people associate loss of employment there with the loss of social networks, the end of contribution, and frankly, sort of the unknown of what life will be after that. And that was a common theme that I heard really throughout my time in Japan.
Wow. It's so great to hear that from you, that in a culture that, as you said, society that you would think is the last place, that had so many things against it, obstacles preventing it from this, that it actually happened and that it can happen. One of the and I just remind people to mute themselves when they're not asking a question or talking. Can you talk a little bit about, I know you spent a fair amount of time in Singapore. I noticed there was a common theme around your travels. Great food was the search of great food. But in Singapore, it seems like the government has also really kind of weighed in, and regional areas have really created this social infrastructure to promote kind of an encore life and an encore career.
Yeah. So I would say Singapore is probably the most interesting country in the world. And let's preface it by saying Singapore is quite different from the US. There's a lot of differences, but there are also commonalities and lots to learn. At least that was my takeaway. So Singapore is the most interesting country in terms of social connection in the second half of life, because they've made that essentially the core of public health. And it really, even sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, permeates everything that they do, from lifelong learning to work rules to create incentives for volunteering, creation of micro jobs for older people. And even, I think most interesting for me was in housing. So unlike virtually everywhere else, the Singapore government owns 90% of the housing stock through what they call the Housing Redevelopment Board. And they make it, the rules associated with getting housing really are very much encouraging connecting older people and younger people, keeping families together, incentivizing multi-generational households, or for instance, I had sort of a minder from the National University who helped shepherd me around, and she lived right a floor below her in-laws, and that's not because, and everything's done by lottery, and that wasn't just because of chances, because they incentivize you in the lottery to co-locate, because they believe that keeping families nearby, caregivers nearby, intergenerational relationships near close at hand is a value in terms of creating connection, social connection, purpose, and meaning in the second half of life. And one of the interesting things they did, there's a famous senior housing place in Singapore called Kampung Admiralty, Kampung meaning village in Malay, I believe. and it's won a lot of awards for design. But the interesting thing to me was they made to the name they made Campum Admiralty sort of the neighborhood center. It's built right atop of right on top of the metro. They created sort of the local shopping mall on the first two floors. The big food court is right there in the senior housing complex as a way to draw the neighborhood into the senior center, into the senior housing complex. So very much like where we build, active aging communities far away, put up gates, they're trying to create that intergenerational relationships. And I remember talking this to a guy named John Wong, who is a leader on these issues in Singapore. And I said, "It's fabulous what you've done with Campum Admiralty." He looked at me and said, "Nah, that's old thing. We don't build senior housing anymore. Every housing complex is available for people over 65, but also families and for young people because they want to keep the generations together because they know that the generations fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle." And right. That's a very different approach to this.
Right. And it's such a great theme of your book. And just, you mentioned it in the US, you talk about the kind of the advent of senior communities. Del Webb, who, as a New Yorker, he owned the New York Yankees, and how we have, and the villages, of course, the famous villages in Florida that you visited, you talked about, but it is not a recipe for intergenerational activity when you only have folks who are over 60 or 65 or 55, whatever the rules are, behind in a gated community. But you did talk about some glimmers of hope on that side. And what do you think on that for these kind of senior communities and the new trends that you're finding in the United States and maybe in Canada?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I will say I've been to a lot of 55 plus communities. I've been to the villages and written about it for years. I just did a story for the podcast on Margaritaville, which is Latitude's Margaritaville, which is the Jimmy Buffett theme, one of the Jimmy Buffett theme communities in Panama City. And I will say, unlike many of my sort of fellow travelers in the space, I do think that those communities do a lot right. They create a social norm that encourages everyone to get out of their homes and into community and connect with each other. If you go to the villages, there's a club for everything. There's actually 7 clubs for everything, by my count. And that's something, and they make that easy and accessible and a social norm to get out and connect with people. So I admire that. But it is a weirdly American thing, as you say, first created by a guy named Big Ben Schliefer and then sort of made successful by Del Webb, that they don't really exist in great numbers elsewhere. And it's a fast growing business here. And we know all about 10,000 people turning 65 every day. There is, it is a growing part of the American landscape. And I think there is a cultural danger, a health danger, an ageism danger to divide the generations. I don't think that's particularly healthy. There's a counter trend, I think, also going on that brings people back together in families. The number of multi-generational families, I think, according to Generations United, is about tripled over the last 20 years. Some of that's driven, after the Great Recession, some driven by COVID, but I think there's a general trend of more and more families living together for longer and longer. So there's actually 2 ends of the spectrums going on. I think some of it has to do with imported cultural values from Asia and Latin America. There's a lot going on there that I think is changing the face of what we think is quote unquote normal as we live as families.
Yeah, and and it wasn't just obviously in Asia. You also kind of, one of the bright spots, I think, was it in Texas, where there was some intergenerational and longer life and happiness, and it didn't have to deal with people who are wealthy. Because I think one of the misconceptions, right, is that if you have enough money, that you're able to take care of yourself, you're able to have family around, live in nice surroundings. But you also found that folks that were not necessarily high on the economic scale, in conditions that were not necessarily ideal in an environment, were able to really kind of use that intergenerational activity to age better.
Yeah. So I actually don't think I've never actually really thought about it until you raise it. I've not thought of intergenerational, multi-generational families as being, I think it is more cultural than economic. But to your point, this book actually started on a dusty little street in Presidio, Texas, which is a tiny little town, part of Presidio County, right across the border you can walk across the bridge to Chihuahua, Mexico, which is actually the big city. And I was there for my podcast, Century Lies, because we did a season on outliers. Roz Chetty, who's a social scientist at Harvard, did a study a number of years ago about the relationship between county level income and county level life expectancy. And you won't be surprised that the wealthier the county, the longer life expectancy. And unfortunately, the converse is true. The poorer the county, the lower the life expectancy. And it's almost a mathematical equation. And there are only a handful of places that fall off that don't follow the law, the mathematical laws there. And the biggest outlier is a place called Presidio County, which is one of the poorest counties in Texas. And if you believe the data, which I don't entirely believe, one of the 10 longest lived counties in the US. So we wanted to go to Presidio County and find out, was it nutrition? Was it exercise? Was it healthcare? And it was none of those things. The nearest American hospital is 70 miles away. Nutrition is, the diet is heavily fats and cheeses. And the principal of the high school told me he was considered the local eccentric because he rode his bike to work. But what was true, and there's actually a larger thing called the Hispanic paradox about longer life expectancy among Latinos in the US, is that people live together in multifamily houses mostly. And if they weren't in multifamily houses, they were in essentially multifamily neighborhoods. Cousins next to uncles, next to nephews, next to parents, all in and out of each other's house every day, taking care of each other. And that was, at least the way we reported it, and there's a fair amount of science on this, really the recipe for healthier aging in Presidio County. And everywhere we went for that season, whether it was Wayne County, Kentucky, or Co-op City in the Bronx, that was really the story about, the story was ultimately about social connections. Like in Co-op City, wasn't about multi-generational families. It was about the fact that this was workforce housing. So if you want to get as about far from Presidio, Texas as you can, you go to Co-op City, the largest condominium complex in the world, the largest NORC, naturally occurring retirement community in the world, because it is in New York City, the terribly expensive New York City, it is workforce housing that is cost control and pleasant and nice. And people move there and they don't leave. They leave it to their kids, sometimes legally, sometimes not legally.
Because they can't sell it is why they don't.
Well, they don't want to, right?
Yeah,
they don't want to. I mean, it's right. So like neighborhoods and relationships grow up around, around real estate practices there. So we know about the loneliness of the big city. Co-op City is not lonely. It's healthier than all the surrounding neighborhoods, which have the same economics, but don't have the same social connection.
Yeah, no, I totally hear that. So I want to shift a little bit around to education and higher education. And here at Encore, we are a community of people a lot of professionals who might be in the education space, running community colleges, government, commercial, but really kind of trying to actively change things. And I think one of the themes that seems the traits of some of these great ecosystems that you've found across the globe is around education, continuing education, and involving older population into education. And it seems like we're not doing that here. And was wondering if you could touch on what you found is the key and what maybe advice that you have for us in the US and Canada.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So let's start with the notion that, again, a lot of the things we invented in the 20th century made sense given how long we lived and how we lived in the first part of the 20th century. And in there, 20th century is when we created universal schooling for elementary school and high school, and promulgated the notion that formal education sort of ends at high school or college, or for relatively small numbers after grad school. That was kind of the end of it, which perhaps made sense when life expectancy was 48, as it was at the beginning of the 20th century. As we now have longer careers, and we've begun to understand how important lifelong learning is to cognitive and physical health, that idea of really stopping formal learning earlier in life makes less and less sense. So I went to, when I was in my travels and reporting, one of the places I went to is South Korea, which has a constitutional right to lifelong learning, which is a very odd thing for coming from a country where you have a constitutional right not to have troops quartered in your house. There they have the constitutional right to lifelong learning. And that's largely as a result of the desire to give back to the generation that founded the country and missed out on sort of the economic growth of the Korean boom of the 80s and 90s. And but gradually that has sort of turned into sort of a common understanding that lifelong learning is a way to ensure social participation, citizenry, and good health in the second half of life. So what has happened in Korea is that virtually every city has become a lifelong learning city. It's a designation offered by the Ministry of Education. And what most of the places have done is create lifelong learning classrooms around the city so that virtually anyone in an urban setting has an opportunity to go take classes within a 5 or 10 minute walk. And it's sort of a social norm to do that. It's like, that's what expected. And increasingly in Korea and other places, the idea that you're going to learn a lifelong life course and doesn't end at 21. It doesn't end with work. Something you do throughout your life. And I think that's actually, it's very meaningful. We know the relationship between lifelong learning and health. And you can just see sort of the value that has for people to get out of their homes, meet with others, engage with others, learn, keep their brain active, their mind, and their body active as they connect with others. Here in the U.S., I can't really speak to Canada, but AARP has done a lot of inquiry and research on the subject. Most people still consider themselves lifelong learners. But what they do, the two things, according to AARP, that people do that they consider lifelong learning is read by themselves and watch cable news. And that just doesn't have the social, say what you want about either of those activities. It just doesn't have that social connection. There are actually, I think one of the things to say here in the US is there actually are plenty of opportunities for lifelong learning. But people don't, many states offer free or deeply discounted tuition at their state universities to people over 60 or 65. Perhaps people know about the OLLIs, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes, which are associated with about 110, 120 US colleges. Community colleges are everywhere and they offer opportunities, but they're really not set up, with the exception of the OLLIs, to really respond to the needs of the subject matter needs, the connection needs, the participation needs of older adults. It's just not in the water yet, not in the bloodstream. I think the infrastructure is developing, but we do need more people to understand that connection between learning, social connection, and health.
So as you went into all these communities and you have what I loved about the book was it was such a wonderful story. It was almost like a Paul Thoreau kind of travel book, which was real things happening. And you got these wonderful flavors. So as you immersed yourself in was South Korea or Singapore or Japan or Italy, what were their impressions of us? And because you were there to find out what they were doing and learning, what kind of impressions did they have of us in North America about how we were dealing with longevity or education or.
Yeah. I will say, not to make this political, I mean, what people want to talk to me about, which is this was 24, was like what was going on politically. That's what people wanted to talk about and weren't happy about. I think to answer your question more directly, Lem, I think people generally know about, let's call it the failing life expectancy in the US. We are now, I mean, we just finally, this past year, got to 79, which is barely more than it was 15 years ago. COVID, deaths of despair, have actually flattened and dropped life expectancy, and finally has sort of set a record again by, I think, a tenth of a year in the US. That is a long way behind our peer countries. Japan, it's about 86 now. The median life expectancy for a woman in Japan is actually 90, almost to the decimal point. That means and it's just an extraordinary number. Means if you're a woman and you die in Japan at 89, you don't say, nice long life, you say bad luck. That's a very different thing than goes on here now. And it's not just life expectancy, it's healthy life expectancy. Not only do we live shorter, we spend more years in poor health than people in some of our peer countries by another year or two, or often 3. And, it's such that if you live in Tokyo compared to Chicago, your life expectancy is going to be, your healthy life expectancy is going to be almost a decade more. People around the world know that about the US, and they wonder what has gone wrong. And they know it's more than just our healthcare system. They know it's more than the obesity crisis. They know that in some ways we've become an increasingly disconnected and frankly angry country, and that is a source of poor health.
Let me ask you, because we put, if you haven't been following folks in the chat, we put some of the links to Ken's podcast and upcoming conference. And one of the ones that I always loved, but to this thing, is the 3 not so bad things on aging and longevity, which goes out every Wednesday. But just this Wednesday, to this point, you said you announced you're going to change the name of it based on some new studies.
Yeah, I may overstate. Yes. So for 1 week, we changed it to 3 great things about aging and longevity because of Becca Levy. So Becca Levy, who many of you may have heard of, is a researcher at Yale, and the principal researcher and thinker around the effects of ageism on health, which we often don't. And one of the things she's found over time is the impact those who have positive views of aging live on, those that have the most positive views on aging live about 8 years longer than those who have the most negative views of aging, even if you hold constant for other factors. And that's an extraordinary thing. So, we are in a deeply ageist society here in the US, and we inherit those views. I mean, it's not like older people are less ageist. They've inherited those views about aging, the decline narrative. So she's been an important scholar. Her book, Breaking the Age Code, is a great book. But she came out with a research, her and I think Martin Slade is sort of our research partner at Yale, came out with a study which is almost hard to believe. They followed a cohort. We're so used to thinking about the years past 65 as one is inevitable physical and cognitive declines. And she came out and she'd studied 11,000 people over the age of 65 or across 12 years, and found that about a quarter of people, a little more than a quarter of people, actually improved their cognitive health over that time, and about 30% included their physical health as measured by walking speed over that time. And again, the key differentiator between those who did better and those who declined more was attitudes about aging. And it's really sort of an extraordinary thing. Extraordinary thing, again, about the power of positive views of aging, but also about the idea that our years past 65 are not ones of inevitable decline. They can be years, as I deeply believe, of purpose, meaning, and contribution, but also, for some, physical advancements, which is very much against our expectations as a people.
Yeah, no, that's so great. And that's obviously what defines our network, is around taking that kind of positive outlook and creating purpose and actually making things happen. So we're getting some great questions in the chat. So urge folks to, if they'd like, just to pop in a question or two. I have a few that I've seen there. One is around healthcare, Ken, that, in these housing developments, or new ways to look at housing, intergenerational, in some of these countries. Obviously, they're very different in terms of how government-wise and things, but how are they handling healthcare and providing healthcare? Are there any kinds of models that you're seeing there that could be things that we could kind of begin to look at here for us?
So it's a really good question, and one I'm not well suited to answer. And that's because it's an incredibly complex subject, and this limited brain can only handle so much. But also because I think a lot of the focus in other countries, and here, and I think growing here again, but is the notion that health takes place, not to undermine the value of or diminish the value of health benefits and health care, but by and large, the research shows that health takes place outside the doctor's office, and that the key to healthy aging is actually making sure people stay healthy. And that's really the focus of a lot of these public health efforts: is how do we keep older people active, engaged, and purposeful, so they're more healthy and need less care as they grow older. And that's actually sort of the economics of it, which is if you go to a place like Japan, a super aging country where 30% of the population is over 65 compared to about 19% here, and 10% of the population is over 80. They're terrified about sort of the health cost equations. So the focus is less on, at least for my reporting purposes, like how do we keep this population active, aging, and contributing, so they don't become sort of this huge financial health cost weighting down the entire economy.
Yeah, one of the things I also think about your book, which is great, because not only is it you get to look at all these great things, the other thing I'll mention is that at the end of every chapter, you have this kind of guide or several things that you pull out around learnings or takeaways, which is really kind of very helpful. And you really relate it to the personal side, kind of how to use these lessons. What kind of advice, or what do you think needs to happen kind of for us in the U.S. that would motivate us, the U.S. and us, to have a similar shift to put in practice some of the great examples that you found in your travels?
So it's a great question, Lem. And I think when I started writing the book, and it was a little before Vivek Murthy, as Surgeon General, declared a loneliness crisis. I think we've actually, over the 4 years since I started with the book, or 3.5 years, whatever it is, I think we've gradually begun to recognize in society the importance of social connection to our sense of health and well-being. I now like to think of social connection as now like the weather. Everyone talks about it, no one does anything about it. Because I think we've gotten to that point, and that's a good thing in the sense we've now talking about it. I think the next thing to do is to think about how do we take it on as a social challenge. So even like the MAHA report, which is youth focused as opposed to my reporting, my writing, which tends to be on the second half of life. Even the Make America Healthy Again report, which came out about America's youth last summer, I think. In the report, they talked about loneliness and lack of social connection as being a real risk to American youth. But then when it comes to the recommendations, there are like 180 recommendations, exactly one related to social connection, which had to do with not using phones at school. which is a good idea, but not going to solve the problem. I think we're at that sort of point where we should be asking ourselves, what can we as a society do to try to create more opportunities for social connection in this era of disconnection? And we have a lot of good models to think about it. It's that other countries are ahead of us in terms of thinking about this as a social problem. Japan and the UK have ministers of loneliness to help them think as a society about these challenges. Dr. Ruth, we don't have a minister of loneliness. Dr. Ruth was the New York State honorary ambassador for loneliness for about 6 months before she unfortunately passed away. But that's about it. We need to sort of tackle it as a social problem and invest in it, not just do it as everyone has their own challenges. And I do try to give advice to people for taking it on. But the more we make it easier, the more we create social norms around, the more we create the thing to do, the better off we'll be as a country in terms of healthy aging.
Oh, that's great. So one of the things before we kind of go, I wanted to ask you, you start the book a little bit. You were invited to a wedding, right?
Yes.
And you sit at a table. Was it table 23?
It is table 23, yes.
Okay, maybe you could talk just a tiny bit about the significance of that. And then after you go on all these journeys, I forget what you write, but you say, here's my advice to table 23.
Yeah. So this is actually a little bit of a point of irritation to me, not to you, Lem, but so I travel around the world for 4 months, leaving my family behind, doing all these great, I like to think, great stories and adventures. But the question I get most when I do a book talk or an event is about for people who've read the book, it's about table 23, which occurred about, is a little story that occurred about 20 miles from where I live in Annapolis, Maryland. So I went off to Japan and South Korea and Singapore, and then I had the second leg of my reporting trip, a couple months in Europe planned. And in between the two legs of the trip, I came home to remind my wife and son who I am and do laundry and things like that. So I was home for 2 weeks. And over that one weekend in between those 2 weeks, I went to a wedding in Annapolis with my wife, old friends of ours whose daughter was getting married. And I'm required by order of my wife and others to say, it was a lovely wedding. So whatever I'm going to say about the wedding is not a critique of the wedding. It was lovely. Everyone had a great time. So with that legal disclaimer, so I go, we chat with people, and then you go over this little table that has all these little place cards with names, with your name on it in the table. And I go over, I pluck, Ken Stern, Beth Cooper, my wife, table 23. So it turns out that it's a big tent. And in the main sort of area of the tent, there's room for 22 tables. And then there's a little step down to table 23 where I am at. And most people wouldn't notice this, but I did, because this was the table for the old folks. So it's actually sort of as you think about it, kind of a weird thing. We weren't put on tables based on our interests or who might like who. People were grouped by age. So I was with people who were all 60 or 65. And we were the table talking about retirement and winding down. So everywhere else, they were talking about the great adventures, and people get speeches about jobs and promotions and houses and travel and the opportunity in the future. We were at our table, sort of the heroes were the people who had just retired. And they were talking about the things they were going to do, they were doing in this new retirement for them. So there was Andrea, who was now proud of the fact that she was reading during the day. And there was the mother of the bride's law school roommate's husband who just retired, and he was learning to cook some new dishes. And I thought to myself, that's fantastic. What are you going to do with the other 22 years, 52, and 51 weeks of your retirement? Because we had been trained, I think, and we had been trained to think of the years past 65 as years of decline and winding down. And, just in the actuarial table, these folks probably had 20 or maybe even more good years in front of them. But we have been trained to treat them with the same vigor, the same enthusiasm, the same sense of purpose and opportunity that we've done with the years before. So it became a framing for the book. So my advice at each chapter is for table 23. No one of which will speak to me anymore because they've now read the book and seen all the nasty things I say about them.
That's right. They all hate you. So one of the
Yes,
we've had a few great questions, and this gets to what you just said, which is why I wanted to talk about table 23. So
Yeah.
A lot of folks, as you know, we read about this coming labor shortage worldwide. In the US is going to be a lot of folks over 60 or 55, however you define it, want to keep working. They're finding a lot of barriers around ageism, especially in the US. And we're trying to find out and maybe in Japan they have it or things like that, but real research that points to the contributions that are made to the kaisha, the company or society, of that older workers can make in the society. Do you have any thoughts on that? It doesn't seem like there's a lot of facts or kind of metrics that we can use to promote this.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think there is a fair amount of research that demonstrates the value of multi-generational teams and the effectiveness of multi-generational teams. I think what happens is that runs up against long-held perceptions in the American business that younger workers are faster, more technology savvy, and cheaper, some of which is true. And they're not giving enough weight to either the value of wisdom, institutional knowledge, and experience, and frankly, a fair amount of technology prowess and that older workers have. I think what happened in Japan was not the persuasion of research, but was the pinch of reality, of economic reality. And I do think that probably doesn't provide a lot of solace to people who are feeling that force of ageism right now in the workplace, which so many are. But I do think that's going to come to the U.S. I mean, we do have a surfeit of older workers. We have declining birth rates, and one of the reasons we've been insulated from this is because of a steady inflow of immigrants who tend to be younger and make the workforce younger. And I've read the news. I think that's not happening anymore, from what I can tell, and it's not likely to happen since we've put the "Do Not Welcome" sign out. Not going to happen anytime soon, and that's going to create real different labor force dynamics for American businesses in the next decade. I don't know if that provides a lot of comfort for those who are facing it right now, but I do think inevitably, this will change in the U.S.
Yeah, no, all great things. And I know we've continued to get some questions, but Doug, I just wanted to make sure, check in with you on timing for a second.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll need to shift gears.
I know we have, and you kind of hit on this a little bit, Ken, but more on an individual basis. One of the questions was, as individuals, as a person, based on your travels and seeing all these different forms and these great things, what some advice do you have for an individual who can age better, have more purpose? Are there a few things that you would tell us?
There are a lot of, so I would say a couple things. It's hard because, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there's just a ton of things I could tell, and that's what the book's about. And I even you referenced a couple of my newsletters. After I wrote the book, or as I was finished the book, we decided to start a newsletter that's once a week, comes out on Monday, that's entirely focused on social connection, called Healthy to 100. And it has an advice. I write every week. I answer one question about social connection. Somehow I become an advice columnist, which seems like such an odd change, but everyone has their second or third act, and that's mine to give advice. So I give out lots of advice. but it's going to be different from person to person. So I'll say two things I will say that I think are a little bit more universal. One is, and I say these things a lot, one is perhaps more relevant to other age cohorts, but I really think people should have, we've been trained to think about planning for retirement as being about financial planning for retirement. And that's something we should start young. And that's true, we should. But our planning for retirement should include financials, but shouldn't be limited to it. We should take the idea of what that second half of life is going to be back with the same seriousness and purpose and planning. And we should be our planning for retirement should be about life planning, not financial planning. And I encourage everyone to start thinking about that as early in their life as they can. Where might I live? What second career, what second act, what third act, what gives me joy of connecting with people? All those things are really relevant. And that's sort of the tragedy of Table 23 is that no one had planned for it, because they didn't know they were supposed to. So that's one thing I would say. The other question I get most often, which is around social connection, which I think is something important to say, which is I'm an introvert. How can I be socially connected after I leave work? And I think the research on social connection and friendships is that social connection comes not from being the life of the party or the guy buying the round of beers at the bar. It comes from proximity. So the University of Kansas, Jeffrey Hall, has done research on friendships and found that basically it's about proximity. 80 hours to be a casual friend, 160 hours, I think, to be a close friend. It's why we actually all have good friends many of us have good friends from school, not because we were friendlier there, but because we were next to the same people year after year, day after day, month after month. So I think the challenge of social connection is not to become, the person who is the friendliest, but the person who thinks about where do I get next to people who have similar values. It could be at work, it could be at volunteering, it could be in school,
and it could be
in pickleball, it could be anything.
Right. And
it could be in this group, right?
Right. In this group, I think this is a great way, right, Doug, to kind of end this or bring this, is that finding friends through this experience. I will share that I joined Network Encore about 6 months ago, and have met a lot of wonderful people that I wouldn't have met just on all the calls, and we're working on real life things and trying to make our society and us better. So it's been a great panacea. So Ken, I just wanted to thank you again so much for joining us today and talking about your wonderful book, which is here.
Thank you, Lem.
Yeah. And the signed copies, right, Doug, that we have for members who join us at the network.
Exactly. So thank you, Ken, and thank you, Lem. And thanks to Longevity Workers for sponsoring today's meeting. As I mentioned earlier, we'll send a copy of the recording and all of the resources that the Longevity Project and the Center for Longevity at Stanford puts out regularly so that we can all take advantage of those. I don't know that we're going to need the slides, Aaron, because we have very little time, but I do want to call your attention to a couple of things. One is the opportunity for a twofer, right? To get a copy of Ken's book, but also to join the network. So go to, if you're interested in joining and taking advantage of the offer, go to the Encore Network website, which is encorenetwork.org, and click the red join button at the top of the page, and everything there will be laid out for you, and it'll be easy to join and get a copy of the book. We also have a couple of events coming up that I really want to call your attention to. One is next Wednesday. We're about to launch the Encore Solopreneur Hub. And to help us do that is Elaine Pofeld, who has written extensively, she's a business writer and author, written extensively on the solo economy, which is an interesting option, in particular for older adults who are looking for ways to extend their experience and find new ways to work and to generate income and to make social connections as a part of that. So join us next week. On Friday of next week, that's International World Happiness Day. And to help us celebrate and also learn, we have a coffee chat with Dana Hilmer, who is a certified positive aging, in positive aging, and she'll talk about positive aging, about happiness, and a lot of that has to do with social connection too, as well as purpose and work. So you kind of see a theme emerging here. And then finally, there's a workshop on March 31st, which is on speaking with greater impact. And this is not about public speaking, it's about organizing your thoughts, it's about making your thoughts known in a way that is not just understandable and clear, but also has impact, that actually does the job. Speaking is a lot different than writing. Many of us speak as though we write, or in the same way that we write. This is a way to help us differentiate the way we organize and present our thoughts in the spoken word versus the written word. So join us for that as well. There's lots of other stuff coming up. Go to the website and click the events tab, and you'll see all of the things that are on our events tab in the coming months, including our affinity groups. So thank you all again. Thanks to Ken and to Lem, and have a wonderful afternoon.